the people who are my bosses, but when they say, well, we think that we should follow the same type of marriage that the Bible outlines, I say, well, at what point do I get to marry my 12-year-old? Because I'm 30 now, right? That's what the Bible outlines. 30-year-old men who were established in their industry got to pick their wives, generally 12 to 13-year-old girls. And so you can imagine, there's no love in that relationship initially. Marriage was a transaction. It was a transaction. And so when Paul comes out in Ephesians and says, husbands, love your wives, radical, absolutely radical understanding of marriage. And so our understanding of marriage today, we might say this is biblical marriage because we're following what Paul said. But when Paul said it, it was profound. It was profound. It was so progressive. It was so amazing that Paul would impart this burden onto men to love their wives and lay down their lives for their wives. Because in the Old Testament, men routinely, to save their honor, would kill their wives. Well, this great reversal. You love your wife so much that not only do you not kill her when she shames you, but you actually love her so much that you lay down your life for her. Amazing, amazing. But this is not the context of the ancient world. The ancient world's context of marriage is that it is a contractual agreement, usually for economic purposes. So the arrangement is made between an adult man, usually, it could be in their 20s, but often in their 30s, or in their early, after apprenticeship, so they go through apprenticeship about 12, 13, 14, they start to establish their business, eventually they get their own kind of business going, and then they would go off and find a wife, so, maybe late 20s, mid-20s, and they would marry a person, likely a woman who's, or a girl who's 12, 13, 14 years old. And so it's a contractual arrangement between the girl's father and the man. And so, again, Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, a man will leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife. Radical, radical. No, the woman was supposed to leave and be joined to the husband, but Jesus reverses that, and he's just kind of taking a jab at him. We read over it like it's nothing. Anyway, so this is marriage in the ancient world. It's a contractual agreement. And there is some love that is developed over time, but mainly it's a contractual agreement. And an important subtext of this is that women in this relationship are incredibly vulnerable. Do you understand? Incredibly vulnerable. Because not only are they not picking their husband, hopefully their father has enough love for his daughter that he would pick a man who's not going to abuse her or something, or who's not a known womanizer or something like this. But generally, it's a financial agreement. It's a contractual agreement. And women have no say in this whatsoever. They don't have a say in who they marry. And here's the real kicker, and this is why this NRSV UE comes out this way. Women had no choice in who they married, and they also had no choice in who they divorced. Do you understand? Divorce in the ancient world was only ever possibly undertaken by a man against his wife. So if a man practiced infidelity, got out and became an adulterer, he might be subject to certain fines, legal measures as outlined in Levitical law, but even the death penalty. But short of death, the man has no recourse, or the woman has no recourse for her husband. If he could beat her until she's black and blue, no recourse whatsoever. So women are profoundly vulnerable. They're profoundly vulnerable because here's the other thing that's true. After a woman had been divorced, a man would hand her a certificate of divorce, which would free her to marry other men. But the subtext of that is, who would want to marry somebody who's already been married, who may have children by another man, who may not have children by another man, but if she doesn't have children by another man, why doesn't she? Is she barren? Is she not going to produce you offspring? Well, what about the father's dowry? How much he is going to pay you to marry his daughter? That's already been shelled out. There's no recourse for her. This is why when we read the story of the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4, a lot of people want to say that the woman at the well is supposed to be ashamed of her status as being married off multiple times and the man she lives with now is not her husband. Jesus is outlining for her that she's a marginalized and oppressed person. He's not signaling to us that she is some sort of, scandalous woman. He's not judging her. He's judging the people who have harmed her. So women are profoundly, incredibly vulnerable in this situation because they can't remarry. And so what happens if they can't get remarried? Well, their father could take them back in depending on how the circumstances of the divorce took place. Well, maybe this guy really was just a jerk and the father believes the woman that he was just a jerk and he just divorced me because he wanted a younger, cuter wife, right? And the father might say, oh, that's awful. I'm going to take you back into my protection. But if not, then she's out on her own. This is why when it says the early church often was said to take up an offering or collection to care for the orphans and widows. Because when a woman does not have a husband, she is profoundly vulnerable. She has no economic recourse. Remember, we talked about this 2 weeks ago. Women have no economic power, purchasing power. They can't buy anything. They can't own anything. Anything that belongs to a woman that she's inherited belongs to her closest male relative. So actually, the Old Testament outlines all of these ways in which women might be protected. You know, the closest remaining relative. If her husband dies, the remaining relative of the husband might have to marry her, or she might have a kinsman redeemer, as in the case of Ruth and Boaz, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the understanding of marriage in the ancient world. This is not a love relationship. It's not an equal relationship. It's one way. It's ultimately impressed upon the woman. The woman has no autonomy to get a divorce, to remarry. You're starting to get the picture, right? So when the NRSVUE comes here and says, but I say to anyone who divorces his wife, except for on the grounds of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. What Jesus is saying here is that only men can divorce women. And this is important. If we change the language here to be inclusive, we actually miss the point. Only men can divorce their wives. And so if you're wondering what a certificate of divorce looks like, I found a picture of a first century certificate of divorce right here. I divorce you. That's all it was. That's all it was. Sometimes they included the tagline, you're free to remarry whoever you want, but they didn't have to. Literally, a man could take a pen, he could write on this thing, I divorce you. Done. They only later implied that he had to place it in her hand because so many men were throwing it at women. Yikes. That's all it is. This isn't all, 15-page legal document. I know we have some family attorneys here that talk about how long divorce decrees are. This is one page. I divorce you. So when Jesus says this, in Matthew 5, I say anyone who divorces his wife except for on the ground of sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. Do you know who he's actually protecting? The women. Because before Jesus, in the Hillelic school, rabbinic school, of which Jesus was a part, this is one of the ways that Jesus was not like his teachers, they had come up with this at-will divorce thing. So this is the pretext, this is the subtext of what's going on in the New Testament. Between the Old Testament and New Testament, rabbis had come together and they had come up with this new form of divorce called at-will divorce. It means that you can divorce your wife for any reason. Because men, should have the right to do what they want with their bodies, right? This has been a thing for 2,000 years. Women, maybe not so much. But men, always. And so you can divorce a woman for any reason, according to the Hillelic school that Jesus came from, except Jesus comes and says, no, actually you can't divorce a woman except for in cases of sexual immorality. And here, it's distinguished that the woman would have been a consenting party to that sexual immorality. That's the words that are used here. So unless your wife literally goes and sleeps with another man, Jesus says, which is outlined in Deuteronomy as well, you can't divorce her. And this is actually a radical protection for women. Do you understand? It's a radical protection for women because it no longer allows men to just cast women off where they are economically unfeasible to survive and starve on the streets. It's a protection for women. And the Old Testament actually has a story that's similar to this that I'm going to cover here really quickly. I'm not going to go into the whole thing. But it's the story of Judah and Tamar. It's stuck right in the middle of Genesis. I think it's chapter 38. I'm not quite sure, 37 maybe. But in the middle of the story of Joseph and his epic through Egypt, in the end of Genesis, we have this weird text that's just stuck in the middle of Genesis. And it's the story of Judah and Tamar. And Judah is one of Joseph's brothers. In fact, this is the line of which Jesus comes from. He comes from this line. And this is the story. Judah has 3 sons. His first son, I forget the guy's name, his first son marries a woman named Tamar. And he is wicked in the sight of the Lord. He's a wicked and evil man. And so what is inferred in the text here is he did something really, really bad. Probably, or likely, or included in this, is that he did something against his wife. So he perhaps beat his wife. He was an abuser. And remember, she has no recourse to do anything. I mean, this is even before the Levitical law, but she has no recourse to do anything. And so God kills the oldest brother, takes the older brother, to potentially save Tamar. It's kind of unclear in the text whether that's the impetus, but I think that some scholars have hypothesized that that's the meaning of the text, that to save Tamar from continuing abuse, God kills her abuser. And, Levitical law says that, which is funny because before Levitical law, but anyway, they still follow it because Genesis is weird. Judah says to his son, Onan, his second son, you have to marry your brother's wife and give her children. Because remember, women have no economic power. So if a woman has a child, especially a male child, he can take care of her. If she has a daughter, she can get potentially work that out somehow where she could live with her daughter's family. But she needs some sort of power. She has no power to do anything. So God says to Onan, you have to go and, Judah says to Onan, you have to go sleep with your brother's wife, your brother's widow, and give her children. But Onan is wicked in the sight of the Lord, and Onan, the text says, spills his seed on the ground whenever he lays with her. And the idea here is that he's withholding economic power from her. So he's taking advantage of her body, but he's withholding the economic power that she could get out of that relationship. And so God, it's like the 3 little pigs. God kills that one too. And then he's got a little brother, but the little brother's not an adult yet. And so Judah says to Tamar, okay, go live with your father, and when my youngest son is old enough, I will marry him to you so that he can fulfill what his 2 brothers could not. And she lives with her father for many years, and she realizes that this kid's got to be grown up by this point, and he is. He's been grown up, and he potentially is married to somebody else. The text doesn't say, but he's too old to marry her now. And Judah has done wickedness. So what Tamar does is she puts a veil over her face, which dresses her up like a prostitute. And she goes to the side of the road where prostitutes often sat, temple prostitutes, and she waits for Judah because Judah's wife had just died. And when your wife dies in the Old Testament, what do? Go find a prostitute. Gross, I know, but it's what the text says. So he goes looking for a prostitute, and he finds Tamar, and Tamar sleeps with him, and she says, what will you give me to sleep with you? Because that's the transaction that takes place with a prostitute. And he says, I'll give you a sheep. And she says, you have to give me something so that I know that you'll give me the sheep. So he gives her his cord. This is like an ID badge. It's like his driver's license. He gives her his driver's license, essentially. And he says, yeah, so now you have my driver's license. When I come back, I'll give you the goat. You give me my driver's license back. Tamar had no interest in this. She didn't want the goat. She wanted a kid. Did you get it? Come on, guys. Thanks. She didn't want the goat. She wanted a kid. So instead, what she does, she sleeps with him. She becomes pregnant by him, and she never goes to pick up the goat. She just has his driver's license. So then they tell Judah, who's still, somewhat responsible for Tamar, hey, your daughter-in-law is pregnant because she's been prostituting herself. And he says, we got to kill her. 2 birds with 1 stone. I didn't want to marry you to my youngest son anyway. We got to kill her. So he shows up to kill her, and what happens? You guys know? She pulls out the cord and she says, the man who impregnated me is the one who gave me this. And Judah says, you are more righteous than I am. So what is this story about? This story, as dark and gritty as it may seem, this story is actually about how women take back control over their circumstances, in this case by prostituting herself to get another husband. So eventually Judah takes care of her, he gives her all she needs, and her child grows up and gets married himself, and that child eventually comes from the line of Jesus that we'll celebrate in Advent. But what does this mean for us today? Because this story of Judah and Tamar, it kind of situates itself right in the middle of the Old Testament context where women have no power, and it shows an example of a woman using what little power she has to gain the economic freedom that she needs to survive. So what does this mean for us in the modern world? Well, when we talk about divorce, we have to ask, number one, who's being protected? Is divorce, I didn't say should Christians get divorced. You notice I changed that today. I didn't say can or should, because I think we'd all agree, in the best case scenario, Christians should never get divorced. Nobody goes into a marriage looking to end it. But when you look at a marriage that has fallen apart, where you have to make the best of a bad situation, where there's a child being raised in a household that we know that child is not going to grow up well because there's constant strife and conflict. You might say, well, but you don't want him to grow up in a single-parent household. Actually, science says you do. Research says it's better to grow up with one stable and emotionally regulated parent than two parents who are fighting all the time. Well, how do you make the best of a bad situation? Well, would we say that the best thing for Tamar to do is to prostitute herself so that she sleeps with her father-in-law until she gets pregnant? No, but she made the text says, I'm not saying, the text says she made the best out of a bad situation. So because this is the case, we have to look at marriage in the modern world from this lens. What is divorce doing? Is divorce saving a woman from a man, or a man from a woman who's constantly abusing them in ways that their mental health is at risk and they're suicidal or something? Is divorce an economic freedom from a woman who's being held captive, or a man who's being held captive by the finances of her spouse? Is divorce making the best of a bad situation for a kid who is growing up in a household where everybody is yelling and fighting and throwing bottles at each other every night? What leads to the most flourishing? What Jesus said is that putting a woman out on the street by herself with no economic power or ability to sustain herself, that's not flourishing. You don't just get to at-will divorce people because you want to marry somebody cuter. So if that's what you're coming to me with, well, I want to marry somebody else because they're prettier than my spouse or more handsome than my spouse. Yeah. No. Divorce, not okay. But there are circumstances, and the Bible is a messy book about messy people. There are circumstances where divorce is the best option for the most flourishing for people. Jesus' words on divorce are about protecting women. I want you to take that away this morning. His words on divorce are about protecting women from men who seek to enact their will over them because they have power. And really what they're about is Jesus' words are about protecting those with no power from those who would wield it unjustly. And so when divorce, in the rare case, or maybe in the common case these days, leads to more flourishing, I believe that the text not only allows it or permits it, it requires it. Do you understand? It's a hard, hard thing. It's never the best case. But if the story of Judah and Tamar tells us anything, it's that sometimes doing the thing that causes the most flourishing, even if it in itself is yucky and nasty and you never want to see it happen, might be the way that God interacts. And by the way, if you haven't seen the parallels to Jesus yet, is the best case scenario a cross? No. But it's making the best out of a bad situation. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we ask you in this moment to give us the eyes to see the ways in which you can turn our graves into gardens. You can turn our mourning into dancing. You can give beauty for ashes. You can turn shame into glory, bones into armies, seas into highways. That you can make a way when there feels like there is no way. That you can make flourishing from mess. Amen. So I've searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. Wait, freeze that. There it is, world. I've searched the world. Make the best out of the bad situation. It couldn't fill me. A man's empty praise, the treasures that fade, are never enough. Then you came along and put me back together. Now every desire is now satisfied here in your love. Sing, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing is better than you. No, I'm not afraid to show you my weakness, my failures and flaws. Lord, you've seen them all, and you still call me friend. 'Cause the God of the mountain is the God of the valley. There's not a place your mercy and grace won't find me again. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing is better than you. Would you stand with us? We're going to sing that chorus again. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing is better than you. As we start to sing, you turn mourning to dancing. I want you to think to yourself, what are the ways that God has made the best of a bad situation in your life? What are the ways that God is calling you to messy resolution? Because there is nothing as good as God. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn mourning into dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. Oh, there's only one who can. You turn graves into gardens. You turn graves into gardens. Lord, there may be ways that we've messed up. We've gotten into things that are too messy. People have changed. People are hurting each other. The fruit of the Spirit are no longer present in our life. Maybe it's our job, Lord. Maybe we need to break up with our job because the fruit of the Spirit is no longer there. Maybe it's a relationship, sure. Maybe it's a substance or an addiction. Maybe it's our social media, Lord. Lord, if there is a way that we're being held captive, we ask that you would make a way where there seems like there's no way. Amen. So friends, as you go from this place this morning, know that nothing is better than God. And sometimes it gets messy, and that's okay. Go in peace to love the serve the Lord. Stick around for cafe.
You turn bones into armies. You turn seas into highways. You're the only one who can. Who can. Only one who can. Thank you so much for all your help. Thank you.